A very good evening to all our viewers in India and very good morning to all our viewers in the USA. Today we have with us a lady who has worked very hard in the space of technology and CSR. She has worked with some of the prominent companies such as Intel and is presently heading diversity, inclusion, and external partnerships manager at Dropbox. We would all like to welcome Ms. Stephanie Smith on our show. Stephanie,
Yeah, thanks, Harsha. Super excited to be here.
we are looking forward to learning more from you on this platform. So, Stephanie, you have done ME in Conflict and Peace Studies and are now enabling the CSR of one of the top tech companies in the world, Dropbox. How has your journey been?
Very interesting and not the traditional route. So I ended up doing a double master's at University of Constance in Germany in international administration and conflict management, and University of North Carolina in conflict and peace studies. So many of my peers at University of Constance went to work at the United Nations, peacekeeping, conflict nonprofits, you name it. Not really the path that I took. I didn't really figure out that I wanted to do corporate social responsibility related work until University of North Carolina, and that kind of spurred my interest in the field. So I got my start at Intel through a corporate social responsibility internship at its Munich site, as many of us start in the intern field, where I developed and managed our Intel Involved volunteer program, which is a social impact program at over 50 international sites. I worked with site coordinators on the ground to remotely manage events and inspire and lead coordinated volunteer events. And the one thing I found, which was really cool, is that the site coordinators were super engaged. They each developed a network of nonprofits to volunteer with locally that they were either connected with or other employees at their site were connected with. And I began to start understanding that most corporate social responsibility work is working by influence. This is the main piece of our work, really a core tenet. You don't directly control much. Volunteers will engage if and when they have time in between their work. Even with the flexible volunteer time off policy, it's when they have time, right? So we as CSR practitioners have to understand these constraints. But also, they must have sort of a personal link to the nonprofit. What pulls at the heartstrings for them? Is it helping animals at a rescue? Is it educating children during National Engineers Month? Or is it serving at a food bank helping the homeless? I also found that leadership support is invaluable. If your manager or site lead is advocating for a volunteer event, you will definitely engage more volunteers. And so in this way, I started kind of building my community in corporate social responsibility, which is really vital to this kind of work, whether that be networking relationships for other CSR practitioners in the community, or nonprofits that are locally in my community, or international nonprofits as well. That's really important to this kind of work. So those are kind of the things I learned when I was working abroad, and then I ended up moving to Intel in Folsom, California, where I managed our corporate social responsibility for that site. We called it public affairs at the time, because a lot of the work that I was doing was public relations work as well as governmental affairs work, and then social impact and volunteerism. And I also managed our small remote sites engagement program around the world. So some of my takeaways there, much different experience. Really found how important it is for relationship building in this kind of work. I broadened our volunteer nonprofit base to over 300 nonprofits and school stakeholders, which required being as open as possible for new partnerships, spending time developing those partnerships, doing phone calls instead of emails if they don't really, use email. And I ended up increasing our volunteer participation to over 72% of the site. And I attribute this to a heavy engagement around team volunteer events, as well as organized annual volunteer weeks. Those were super helpful. One other thing I'll point out here that I found is that celebrating your volunteers is extremely important. We hosted an annual volunteer celebration and recognized those volunteers who spent a lot of time in the community. The last thing is to not underestimate what you or your company can contribute. I spent a good deal of time building out our in-kind donation process so that those phased out Intel laptops, which otherwise might be resold or thrown in the trash could actually be put to good use in local schools and community organizations who were in very desperate need of hardware. And even though we had to pull out hard drives for security reasons, other companies ended up donating those so nonprofits could really flourish. So those are kind of my learnings from those three, work experiences.
Wonderful, Stephanie. It's really inspiring to see the work that you're doing at Dropbox. Now, since past a year and a half or almost 2 years, the world has been at a standstill due to Corona virus, and we would like to understand in these difficult times what are the initiatives that have been taken under your aegis.
Yeah, so COVID-19 was tough for all corporate social responsibility practitioners. We had to transition to everything being virtual. I don't think a lot of us had experience doing that. This is kind of a good segue to talking about my time at Dropbox. So when I was working at Intel, I really enjoyed working with our employee resource groups, which are based on affiliations. And I decided I really wanted to take my experience portfolio a step further, wanted to learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I had some experience in the field, but by no means was I, trained in that field or had, studied that field. So I moved to Dropbox, took on a new challenge. It's been quite different. And I was hired on to manage our external partnerships with our nonprofits and then also our diversity conference events. So during COVID, all these had to move virtual. None of us really know what we were doing. We had to really learn on the job. None of us knew anything about virtual events. So what I did there was kind of spend a good deal of time learning about what motivates people to attend virtual events and how we could maintain engagement with our diverse candidates through online platforms, such as StreamYard, for example, or Hopin we used quite frequently. And most importantly, finding a lot of backups and workarounds when things did not work out, which they inevitably would not work out. There was some issue, a platform crashed. The effectiveness of the platform was not great for what we wanted. And so really being creative and come up with ways to kind of deal with that. And so all, practitioners, we always need to have a plan B and a plan C on hand at all times, just in case, things don't work out the way that we expect.
Wonderful, Stephanie. Now, Stephanie, you're working at Dropbox which is one of the largest IT firms. There are people from diverse backgrounds over here. How do you ensure diversity and inclusion while you're treating with all your employees, all your stakeholders, or your vendors? What are the initiatives or thoughts that you consider?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think at Dropbox, we do a variety of things. The things that I directly manage are sponsorship of our diversity conference events like Grace Hopper, which is the world's largest gathering of women in computing. And at these events, what I've learned through this experience is that you're competing with hundreds of other big name corporate sponsors for talent, and you need to stand out. So how do you do that? Provide candidates opportunities to engage with you and remove barriers to that end. Develop a booth that really speaks to your particular audience that you're trying to reach rather than looking all kind of corporate-y. And also have fun swag. That's always really important. So that's kind of a big part of what I do is really work on our diversity conference partnerships and look at how we can recruit diverse talent to come work for Dropbox because the first step is really looking at how we can hire externally for diverse talent, but also retention is really important as well, right? So if we have diverse talent working at Dropbox, we want to make sure that they feel like they have a path at Dropbox, that they can stay at Dropbox. So another thing that my team worked on, which I find is really interesting to external audiences, is stay interviews. So we all know what exit interviews are. I'll explain for those that don't. So, you leave your job, you quit, you decide that you want to go somewhere else. Maybe the career path isn't what you're looking for. There's no advancement. You realize you could make more money somewhere else. So you leave your job, right? Well, so we kind of turned that on its head and thought about how can we actually do something a little bit different and look at folks, consider folks that are potentially high risk, that are from underrepresented minorities in the US, which is pretty applicable, or gender diverse abroad is much more applicable. And we suffer from a lot of talent in general in the San Francisco Bay Area. Tech companies suffer from a lot of talent of people jump companies, right? Um, so to combat this, we came up with this idea of stay interviews. So if you meet, you would meet with your manager and talk about what motivates you, right? And that's different for every person. Maybe for someone who's a mother, it's making sure there's a work-life balance. Maybe, for me, I ride horses. So I want to make sure in the afternoon I can go do that before it gets dark in the winter. Everyone has the things that motivates them. A lot of times it's their career path, right? What path do they want to take and how can they get there? We need to make sure that that's being outlined for them. Promotion, maybe they were missed last promotion cycle. Why? What can they do to change that? And what do they need to work on to get where they need to get? So these kind of stay interviews really helped us identify with these particular high risk diverse candidates that we were trying to retain, what they could do, what Dropbox could do for them to retain them, but also how we could kind of forge a path for them that they really wanted to have, so that they had a future at Dropbox and they could foresee that and didn't have to jump and leave companies.
That's a pretty interesting concept to introduce a stay interview instead of exit interview. It's okay. Moving from there, you also managed a volunteering program for an IT firm covering 40 European nations. What were your learnings on stakeholder engagement over there? Because there were people from different backgrounds, different languages too.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you manage that situation?
Yeah, that was very interesting as well as a lot of learnings. I think I spoke a little bit about this above in terms of leading by influence and that you do not control things. Just give that up at the beginning. Know that you're not going to control outcomes because this is the kind of work that we do. Things have to kind of happen naturally, but you can encourage them, right? You can set agendas, or you can set, for example, objectives that you want to achieve from a higher level. So at Intel, for example, we like to support girls or women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And so most of our engagements that we came up with from a tops down perspective were around those items, right? So educating girls or women, for example, in STEM, how can we expose them at an early age? And a lot of the research actually shows that girls decide in the 4th or 5th grade, this is US speaking, so translate that to your particular country, but they really decide in the 4th or 5th grade whether they're going to study science, technology, engineering, math. So if they're not exposed to that at an early age, then they're not going to be able to really understand what opportunities are out there, right? So for us, a lot of the work that we were doing, that we'd kind of push from a tops down is, can we get into schools that, might have a high majority of free and reduced lunch students in the US? This is terminology that we use. We call it Title I. Can we get into some of those schools and show them the basic tenets of engineering? We can do fun things like building a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. We would have some engineers who go to these schools, they'd stand in front of these students, and they would basically become a robot. And they'd say, how do I build a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? And the students would have to say, oh, you put the peanut butter on the jelly. So they take the jar of peanut butter and the jar of jelly and put it on top of each other. And the students are like, no, you're doing it wrong. You need to put the peanut butter on the knife and then apply that to the sandwich bread and then put the jelly. And so, so forth and so forth. So showing them, how that works with commands, and basically where the robot is volunteer at the top, at the front of the classroom. So making engineering and technology and science, making it very fun, right? Because you want to engage those younger audiences. And so how can you do that? So that's one thing I kind of found, was making sure that you are communicating and leading these kind of initiatives. You have some sort of path, right? So if volunteers can really volunteer anywhere, there's not really a direction, and they can. However, you want to just have those opportunities available, from the tops down, where you have some sort of focus, right? Because a lot of volunteers are like, I'll do anything. Let me know what you want me to do. So, you kind of need to direct them. Another learning that I had from my time at Intel was to find that each Intel site has a very different culture that participates, or that really affects the way that they participate in corporate social responsibility. So, for example, in Asian countries, if a site leader tells the employees to volunteer, they do it, right? If a site leader in Arizona does that, we might get 5% of employees to participate. So thus, volunteerism in the U.S. needs to hit really differently than it would abroad. Do the employees have kids in a local school where they want to volunteer? Can your engineers use their talent to help solve problems that nonprofits face, such as building a database for matching patients with rides to their appointments? In Europe, I learned that some cultures, like Germany, view volunteerism as a very private activity that they hold close to the heart, and they don't think that their work life really should mesh with their personal life, right? It's very separate. So that includes volunteerism. So we run into the issue sometimes of getting folks to actually report their volunteer hours, which is, of course, important when we're tracking how effective our volunteer programs are, because they felt it was very personal, confidential information. Why should they share it with their company, right? So that's definitely something I found, was that there's a different challenge for every single region that you need to consider, and a one size fits all model doesn't really work most of the time. You really need to be regional and think about like what works for each individual site.
That's pretty interesting. It's a cultural difference that exists. I see that. Um, now, Stephanie, many of the companies and many industries require social license to operate, especially when it is mining or extractive industry. What kind of social license to operate does an IT company require?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at Intel, we talk a lot about we talked a lot about license to operate, right? So this means that you must protect a company's license to operate to ensure success in that location. So all of your local engagements, such as your volunteer activities with nonprofits or your donations to local organizations, need to help support that goal. This is especially important to a company like Intel, who often opens offices in towns like Hillsboro, Oregon, or Folsom, California. And what happens is there's not really anything there at the beginning, right? And the town kind of builds up around these sites. So the expectations are very high that that company is a good corporate citizen. The other thing to think about, though, is if you're doing all these volunteer events and you don't let people know that you're there doing them, did it happen? Question for you. So that's another thing that I will say is this is why capitalizing on opportunities to secure positive media stories is also very important to corporate social responsibility. You need to make sure you're telling your story, right? We can all do good things all day, every day, and that's great. Makes us feel good. But from a corporate social responsibility point of view, from a particular company point of view, right? You want to make sure that people know that you're out there in the community. You want to make sure that you're wearing your volunteer T-shirt and people see your company out there doing good in the environment. You want to make sure that you're being seen. And nonprofits are more than happy typically to offer these opportunities. So I would definitely recommend connecting with your nonprofit partners. Find out if they can pitch media for you at your next local volunteer event, or maybe they can put out a press release for your partnership. It helps them and it also helps you. And that's kind of what I found around license to operate.
That's an interesting takeaway. Now, Stephanie, you worked with Intel. Now you're working with Dropbox. What are your thoughts on digitizing the remotest corner of the world in emerging countries, and the resources it may require, and the steps that we should take in order to achieve this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think all companies really have to consider how they can engage in emerging countries, considering that's where, a lot of their clientele is, for example. That's maybe where they produce things. Um, so I would say consider the tools that you have at your disposal. Is it a cloud storage file sync and share turned smart workspace like Dropbox that could help a small mom and pop business or nonprofit in India organize its work to move from file cabinets to having everything online while still ensuring privacy and making sure that people aren't seeing those files, just their employees? All of a sudden, they can hire and communicate with remote workers outside of the city who might otherwise not have had those opportunities, and they can help with their business, provide more jobs in those areas. What service do you have as a business, or what service do you have that a business or a nonprofit or a community might find useful? How can you train them to use it, right? What do you have to offer? And then don't shy away from working with nonprofits that are doing good work on the ground in emerging countries, right? Consider how much of your customer base is in emerging countries now or in the future. Maybe now you don't have a ton of customers there, but in the future you might have a ton, right? Because it might be a target. So consider that definitely. And so these are kind of things I think of when I'm envisioning how we can connect the world, the whole world, with the tools that we have at our disposal. Really think about what tools you have for your company and that you can utilize as well.
I'm sure that all of the people from the emerging countries are listening to this and hope that we would be able to incorporate these inputs. Now, IICSR is a dedicated institution for research, development, capacity building for responsible business leadership. What kind of courses do you think that the present workforce requires and the future may require, especially post-COVID times? And considering that education stream has evolved fairly, what forms of learning would you all be looking at? A gamified learning, recorded videos, online, conventional, offline? What kind of learning do you see that will come into picture now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, in person and hybrid events and learning are starting to come back. So, although we need to really think about the accessibility of some of our learning, we are looking at more in person events now. I will also say that on demand learning is always a good idea for people to learn at their own pace and is very inclusive of folks that might learn at a slower pace, for example. I just completed an employee-wide conference at Dropbox, and we really dug into the idea of how important gamification can be to keep people engaged while they're online. So I definitely think that gamification is always a good idea. And as I mentioned before, accessibility is always very important for diverse populations. How can you offer this particular lecture across time zones, whether it be live or pre-recorded in certain regions? How can you make it accessible to different populations? How can you make it accessible to folks in India or in the US at the same time? Or maybe you host 3 sessions, one that's Namer friendly and one that's EMEA friendly and one that's APJ friendly, right? So I think considering how we're offering this learning is really important. And I think that this new digital age that we're in, whether it be new, whether you consider it old, definitely the age that we've been forced into with COVID has really made us rethink how we offer these kind of learnings. And so I would definitely recommend just a wide variety of learning formats to enable folks to learn at their own pace for hosting these kind of sessions and lectures.
Great. Thank you for patiently answering all my questions. We have few questions from our fellow panelist today, Dr. Hopkins.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
And greetings from the east coast of Africa.
Oh, wow.
Quite a long way away from you. I was intrigued with what you were saying. What interests me, you did kind of touch on it, was what we call the business case. You touched on it in a lot of your discussions, especially working with NGOs and the rest of it. What we often advise companies and institutions is, first of all, to identify all the key stakeholders in the company or entity, and then to see how CSR impacts on them and vice versa. And a lot of it is not simply, and it seems that you're pretty high-powered at this in giving money to useful projects, but also how the company works itself in terms of behavior towards its employees. And I'm sure you know much of this discussion, the board of governance, how transparent are operations, especially in these days, as you know very well, in the United States. So I'd be very interested if you could just expand a little bit on, we call it the business case, which is somebody's going to say one day, why are you giving money away right across the world? How is it helping our business? You touched on it a bit, and transparency is very, very important. But I wonder whether you've thought of actually you're looking at your program in terms of the business case. And there's another issue that I've been working on, which is about what I call the big issues of the day and how companies are involved in them. And I've suggested that the companies write a short report. We want not too long, because nobody reads long reports these days, but a 10-page report on how your company copes with the big issues of the day, and whatever they are. Certainly in your country, in the United States, the focus the last couple of years has been COVID, but it's also been democracy as such. And it's kind of a sensitive subject, I know, to talk about. So I know you have to choose your words very, very carefully. So two questions really: business case and the big issues of the day, and whether what you do about it, and also tell people about it as well. So thanks very much, and I enjoyed very much your presentation. Very, very clear indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Hopkins. I think that's a really good question around business case, right? So one thing we have to think about is, why are you doing things, right? Why are you volunteering in your community? Why are you giving donations out? There has to be a reason why. So definitely transparency and authenticity are extremely important. There's a few things. So one, you have to think about why people join your company. So this is getting to be more important, especially with the newer generations. They want to work for a company that they know is socially responsible. You need to show them why you're socially responsible, what you're doing, how you're connecting with, for example, the homeless in your area. How are you helping them? What education initiatives are you doing? So definitely that, in terms of attracting talent to your company. And the other thing is, as I was talking about these sort of higher level volunteer initiatives, for example, around girls in science, technology, engineering, math. So for tech companies that are trying to hire engineers, we have a huge problem in the US, and I would assume I think abroad we have a similar problem, but we don't have enough women in the engineering field, right? So we're having that problem though early on, right? And so how far back does a company look from a tech company perspective, right? So for example, if you're looking at targeting girls that are in 4th and 5th grade when they decide if they're going to study science, technology, engineering, and math, you will then kind of start them on a journey where hopefully eventually they will decide to study engineering in college, and then they'll come work for your tech company X number of years later, right? So you're developing that pipeline of talent, because if you don't do it, who else is going to do it? And some companies start at maybe the high school level, and they say, how can we get into some classes in high school and make sure that, we're getting science, technology, engineering, math, and pathways out there? Because then, for example, maybe they go through middle school and they're, super energized by what they're learning, but they get to high school and are told that, they can't go to college because their parents didn't go to college, or they can't afford it, right? So giving them those pathways and helping them understand that, yes, you can go to college. There is a path for you. This is how you can get there. So that's kind of the second level tier, right? And then the third level is at the college level. They've probably already decided what they're going to study, so it's almost too late at that point. But a lot of tech companies will look at curriculum and how they can help inform some of that curriculum and kind of guide it in the right direction. Because the worst thing that you would have is a student that spends 4 years studying in one of these fields. They graduate with an engineering degree and they don't know anything about, how to really do engineering at a company. So we want to make sure that they have the skills that they need to be able to be successful in the industry once they get there. So those are kind of the three things that I would think of. And then larger question around democracy. Very large question. I'm not really sure how to answer that one, but I think we've seen a lot around tech companies and their CEOs, supporting democracy, supporting these kind of things, these kind of directions. And I think there's a lot of political things that can come into play when you look at that. I think my one piece of advice for, CSR practitioners is to guide your leaders to make sure they're making decisions on behalf of the company that represent the company. Again, you have your employees who are working for this company and they have this idea of what your company values are. So at Dropbox, for example, one of our company values is be worthy of trust. And it's extremely important for everyone at the company. And we take it really to heart, right? And that permeates through every aspect of our work. Also, we have this sort of smart workspace solution. And so we need to make sure that we're taking privacy to heart, which is very, very important for a company. So we need to make sure that permeates at the upper levels as well. So I would just say linking your company's values, who everyone is signed up for, to what your leaders are saying is really important, because when those two things don't align, it's not great. And then we as CSR practitioners have to go kind of deal with it, any sort of fallout as well that might come up from, a leader saying in the press something that your whole company is not on board with. And I think that happens quite frequently at different tech companies. So that's kind of how I would address your second question, but it's quite a big one. So. Oh, I'm not sure I hear you anymore, Michael. I think you're on mute.
Muted myself. I muted myself quite appropriately, I think, for me, as harsh to know. But I'm interested in the big issues of the day, as companies more and more become aware or are involved in them or are so big. I don't think Dropbox is quite as big as Microsoft as yet, but maybe, who knows, in a year. You never know these days how things change. But some of those big companies really do have a strong influence on how governments run, not only within the country, but also in terms of international relations and so on. Mm-hmm. And especially the big issue of the day, of course, is with China, maybe to a certain extent Russia. So anyway, good luck in your way forward, and I'm very pleased to see Dropbox has got such competent people running their CSR program. So, and good night from Africa.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for staying up late. Hi, Sandeep.
Hi, Stephanie. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
So I heard you speak about STEM, and that's something that I'm very closely connected with, being an engineer myself. I used to volunteer for a nonprofit in India to teach science and math, and I really feel that the difference in pedagogy, in sense, the gap is too wide. In India, we have a curriculum that's mainly based on rote learning. How is it possible that nonprofits in India we can do capacity building for them by learning from nonprofits in the US through whatever technologies is available at our disposal? So how did you think there's a remote possibility of knowledge sharing and helping in capacity building for local nonprofits in rural India?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to be learned from both sides, right? Not just one. I think there's a lot for US nonprofits to learn from nonprofits in India as well about how you do things on the ground. So I know in India, there's a lot more grassroots organizations who are doing things. And so, the impact might not be as great, but you are still doing great work on the ground. Whereas nonprofits in the US typically get more money, right? Get more visibility. So they might have a little bit more power to do things, or it might enable them to have a larger impact depending on what kind of support they're getting. I think there's a lot of knowledge sharing that can go on between nonprofits in the US and nonprofits abroad. Do I think that happens quite often? No. I think there's a lot of areas for improvement there. In terms of science, technology, engineering, math, everything could be online, right? Especially now with COVID, like we are all online. So there's no reason why, nonprofits in India, for example, should not be connecting with nonprofits in the US. And I think that there's a lot of learnings there as well, because it's just such a different environment for nonprofits working in the United States versus nonprofits abroad. But I would definitely say, yes, we should learn from each other. It kind of makes me think about this program that we worked on at Intel. It's called the Intel Education Service Corps. And they kind of would go to developing countries and they bring, for example, technology and they would set up at school. For example, they would bring some laptops and systems, and they would, set up a school to have like a computer lab. And they'd kind of teach them how to use some of these programs to be effective. And so you have companies that are doing things like that. Not to say Intel's the only one that does that. I know there's a lot of other companies that also go abroad and do these kind of targeted volunteer projects. But I think that's a good opportunity for companies and then even nonprofits to support them when they go abroad and they, are able to really make that kind of impact locally in these sort of rural communities, and get them that technology. And so I think the US in general, with the amount of resources we have, I hope that companies do consider doing things like that, coming to, rural parts of India and setting up computer labs or enabling them to, get online, right, around this like digitization that we have in the US and that we don't necessarily have in smaller or rural parts of different countries. I think that's something that we can bring to really help those communities. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll look up the Intel program.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, Johnny.
Yeah, ma'am. Thank you so much for throwing some light on CSR activities. So, ma'am, actually, India being a developing country, so we have still a poverty a concern. We have education as a concern. We have health as a concern. So, because of that, if you see our whole CSR spending, more than 50% is spent on these three activities: poverty, hunger, and education. Now, US being the developed country, what do you think? Still, what do you think? More in which activities are the funds invested? Are they still the same on the poverty, education, or in US developed country, the activities are different?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the particular company, right? So, for example, I know that companies like, let me think, McAfee, for example, which was absorbed by Intel, or like let me just speak about cybersecurity companies in general. Like they're going to spend a lot of their budget that they have on supporting cybersecurity and with nonprofits that also work in that space. So I think it really is dependent. So I wouldn't say that there's one particular direction or another. I do know that there's definitely usually focus on poverty. So when companies can, they definitely help at homeless shelters, and just not necessarily, it's an activity that's really accessible, right, to most employees and most companies. However, I think outside of that, you have whatever is driving the company. So like what is the company trying to achieve? So for example, if you're trying to get technology into the hands of students or people abroad, right, what are you doing in that area? So I think it's driven by whatever your company's vision is and also what your company produces. So it's really dependent on that. I can speak on behalf of tech companies, right? Because most of us are focused on, we have engineers. We're super helpful on building marketing plans or building databases, or they can do all of these things for nonprofits and help in that way. However, I think in like the food service industry, it might be totally different, right? They're probably focused on food insecurity because they want to make sure that that's something that they're addressing. So it really, your CSR program should align with whatever your company is kind of aligned with as well, right? Like, what are you trying to achieve there, or what industry are you in? Does that make sense?
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for sharing all your words of wisdom and answering all the questions so patiently, and so insightful information that you shared with us. We from our team of IICSR would like to thank you, and we look forward to having you again sometime.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great. Always happy to take additional questions as well on LinkedIn, or if anyone wants to add me and talk about CSR. I love talking about corporate social responsibility as much as I can, and it's a field I'm very passionate about. So always happy to chat.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.